Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're talking about the reading section of the SAT multiple choice, and we're talking about some sentence completion strategies. Something I want to point out before we jump into this: reading and sentence completion, even the sentence completion part, is different from the writing section. In the writing section, if you've taken those lessons already, you've seen we had a bunch of rules and they worked almost all the time. We could almost always apply these rules mechanically over and over again. Unfortunately, on the reading section, there are no rules that will work every time. They're really basing a lot of these questions on your ability to intuit and read some sometimes fairly difficult structures. So what we're going to be talking about today are some strategies and some basic approaches, but don't treat them as rules. Don't treat them as hard and fast rules that you have to use every time. Use them to try to develop a sense for how a sentence works and for how parts of the sentence work together. So again, unfortunately, it's really based on how well you read, and you can definitely practice and get better at these questions, but it just takes practice. There are no rules that you can memorize that are going to work every time. So we're going to talk about some basics. We're not going to cover every possible scenario that can come up because it's much more important that you become flexible and you become able to recognize the way sentences work. Okay, so let's talk about sentence completion. You all know what they are. You have blanks, and basically you got to fill in the blank. Now, for the most part, these things test vocabulary. That's the biggest thing that's tested in the sentence completion section. However, sometimes the sentence itself is difficult to understand, not because of the vocabulary, but because of the structure of the sentence or some of the structures used in there. So those are the two things you actually want to think about when we're talking about sentence completion. You want to think about structure, and you want to think about content. So when we talk about structure, the big thing we mean is direction. So let's think about direction a little bit. We always have a blank, and we always have a direction. So usually the thing in the blank relates to the direction, but not always. So for example, direction words tell me that one part of the sentence relates to the same part, to a different part of the sentence in the same way. For example, a semicolon is a great idea. We've talked about this before when we're doing the reading section. The semicolon sort of means, okay, here's what I'm talking about, or here's an example. So it really just reinforces the thing that came before it. So a semicolon tells you, look, part 2 of the sentence is going in the same direction as part 1. Same thing with a colon. A colon is a demonstration, an example. It's supposed to show the same thing. So these are all same direction things. Sometimes you see commas. Sometimes you see the word because. They're all relating to the same thing, right? They're all saying cause and effect. That's basically the same direction. Therefore, so, an opening phrase. So for example, if we have intending to train for a marathon, Bob ran every day. The first part of the sentence, intending to train for a marathon, is just separated with the comma, and it starts with this opening phrase. And the second part just reinforces it. It just tells me what I mean by the opening phrase, what that phrase is modifying. And that's another idea with in order to. Like what someone's intention is often really important in determining direction. So intention, anything that shows you what the person's intention is in the same direction. Now what about opposite direction? So you know most of these. These are pretty easy to spot. We got although, but, despite, while, and contrast. We have these we talked about a little bit in the writing section. Once a runner, he is now a swimmer. So that's a contrast, right? Even though there's no but or although, you have a before and an after, and that indicates a contrast. Not often comes up, obviously, as a contrast. More than, so more blank than. So more a runner than a swimmer, he prefers running to swimming. So the contrast is there also between running and swimming. So these are structures, and this is not a complete list because there's a million of them. And there's creative ways that you can make these things happen. We're going to see a couple of these today. So there's really no way to list them. You have to understand how the author's approaching it. Sometimes he's going to be a little tricky. He or she is going to be a little tricky with it. Sometimes they'll use a double negative so that you have to remember it was going in the opposite direction, but then I switched direction again, so it's going in the same direction. And all of these things can get fairly complicated if you try to think of them logically, like you can draw them out mathematically. It's much more important that you can read the sentence and get a sense for it. Okay, but so the first thing you want to do for all of these questions is to figure out direction first. Figure out the way things go, and then take a look at the blank and what we want to put in it. And let's see if we can figure out a little bit what we're talking about here. So we'll take a look at a couple of questions. These are from test 3. Oops. Look at number 7. Before becoming a stockbroker, Victoria Woodhull had a career as a blank. Someone believed to have insights about events beyond ordinary human perception. Now let's take a look here. We have two directions here, and this is why there's no particular rule. It's a great example. It's late in the section. Two things are happening here. Here we actually have a contrast, a temporal contrast. Before becoming a stockbroker, she had a career as a blank. So like the once and now example, this is a contrast between what was happening before and what's happening now. So that's the first direction I see. Second one is in the same direction, and it's after this comma. And what it does is it tells me what goes in a blank. So this part of the sentence, I'm going to draw a little bit on here. I'll try not to draw too much. This part of the sentence, right up until the comma, career as a blank, goes in the opposite direction as stockbroker. So these go in the opposite direction. But this one, this part here, because of the comma there, remember that's a same direction word, goes in the same direction as this one. So we actually have two shifts. First opposite direction, and then shifts to the same direction. And we're going to see how we apply that in terms of content in a minute. But what you want to see is that it's not always a simple decision about what direction things are going in. These things work together. And notice there's no contrast word. All we have is this before becoming a stockbroker, she was this. So that's the same idea of the temporal contrast, something that used to be true and it's not true anymore. Okay, let's get rid of some of these marks now that we understand it. So that's what you want to do. You want to determine the direction before you go ahead and jump into the content. Let's take a look at number 8. We'll do the same thing. This one's a little bit easier. The judges for the chili competition were blank, noting subtle differences between dishes that most people would not detect. All right, so you might be thinking the not here is a direction word, but it doesn't really make a huge contrast here, because we already said that most people would not detect them, and we know it's what they do. So don't worry about things, especially towards the end, negatives and things like that, that don't necessarily affect the sentence. Not everything that looks like a direction word actually has that effect. Let's take a look at what we're talking about here. This one's pretty easy, actually, in terms of direction. Here's my comma. The judges for the chili competition were something. And then it tells me what that something is. So it's going in the same direction. And I don't need to worry right now about the meaning. We'll get to that in a minute. So it's same direction. And one thing to remember, when you have, especially like number 8 at the end of the test, something like this, they're not testing you on the structure of the sentence. You can tell already this is going to be a vocab question. The answer choices are going to have a lot of hard words in it. I don't know what they are, but I know that's the case because this is pretty easy. Understanding the sentence is pretty easy. Okay, so now that we have the direction, we understand this, we start to think a little bit about content. Oops. And let's just jump. Oops. All right. Right over here. Okay. So we have same direction, opposite direction. If you can, figure out the direction before you start thinking about the content. Before you're thinking about what word should go in there, think about the structure of the sentence. Try to get the bird's eye view, because it's easy to get confused. It's easy to lose that structure. So understand it first, articulate it to yourself. Figure out the direction before thinking about the blank. Once you figure out the direction, now we can think a little bit about content. Content means the words, the actual things, the nouns, the adjectives, the verbs, the things that are descriptive that give you an idea of what's being talked about. It's pretty straightforward. It's an easy idea. But you want to really pay attention, especially to things like adjectives and adverbs. You want to pay attention to descriptive nouns and verbs. When you're talking about people, I know it's only a sentence, but you want to try to get inside these people's heads. So think about intentions. They wanted to do this. So if she wants to make her kids be quiet, do you think she's more or less likely to scold them? Something like that. Just try to understand their motivations, intentions, emotions, and policies can be very important in terms of content, because they can inform, once you know the direction, what should go in a blank. If he's trying to accomplish A, he would do B. And again, we'll see some examples. Look for lists of ideas, especially with 2 blank questions, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. 2 blank questions will often list 2 things. Say he was A and B, and put them both in a blank. usually that list is replicated somewhere else in the question. So it's just picking two other words to put right in those blanks. Identify any content words you don't know. Now this is a big one because sometimes you're not going to know the vocab in the question itself, not even in the answer choices. Sometimes you're not going to know the vocab. Still circle the word that you don't know and say, once we get to the next slide, you'll see, say how the blank relates to it. So even if you don't know the word, we're going to talk about how the blank relates to that word, and then we'll be able to make a more informed guess.